And now it's time to introduce Mandy to you, for the few of you who don't know her. She has been here since 2004 when she was an intern, and she has just jumped in with her whole heart and soul. In addition to being at the museum, she's an amazing photographer, has had books published and shows in galleries. She's our technical wizard here, so we're grateful to her for that. She's also involved in the community. I'm trying to tell you things that we don't usually say about her.
The other stuff is not appropriate.
She's involved in the community. She's part of Massillon's Historic Preservation Commission, and she also serves as the Secretary-Treasurer of the Charity School of Kendal Foundation, which provides scholarships to needy college students for the most part. So proud of her activities in the community. Here at the museum, she's our archivist, and I used to do much of what she did when I was here, and I have to tell you, she is the most amazing person. She has organized and identified so many things in our collection. She's just, what she's done for our museum is amazing. And of course, she does fabulous research while she's doing that. And that research is culminated today as she presents her book to you. So I just want to say one more thing. It's very, very generous of her to be here today. She's done a lot of prep work on this program, and it's just 5 days till her wedding. Welcome, Mandy.
Thank you. I mean, what would life be unless you put all of the things on top of the other things and do all of them all at the same time, get married, do a program, whatever, it's cool. I got it. I didn't want to deafen you while I pulled that out of the holder. So, thank you all very much for being here. If you didn't get your copy already, they will be for sale after, and I will be glad to sign them for you. This book is about 3.5 years worth of work put together. Arcadia Publishing, obviously their Images of America series has always been fantastic. The books feel really awesome, and typically the things within the pages are just so fabulous. So when I got contacted by Arcadia Publishing, I was so excited to be able to bring one of those to Massillon. Obviously, my first goal was to not compete with the wonderful publications that Marky has put out. So Towpath to Towpath and Massillon Reflections, I was like, all right. So she's got all of Massillon history covered, and she's got all these great images. Like, is there anything left? Like, what can I find in the archives that we can do that's new? And I was really struggling because you have to have something like a minimum of 180 images, and I was like, oh man, you know, most of Kendal history takes place long before photography comes about in 1839. Where am I going to find all these things? And so as I started pulling images from this time period and photographs of things, you know, buildings that were built during the Kendal era, I suddenly came up with 800 images. I was like, I don't think that they'll extend it to a, you know, massive encyclopedia-sized version for me, so I better start cutting that down. So obviously, there are many, many amazing stories in the archives that we couldn't fit within the pages of this book, but I'm going to share some of them with you today via this PowerPoint printed out for you, since again, the light in here is not conducive for you all to look at a nice screen. So soon we will have an auditorium. Soon. So the reason that I settled on this early era of Massillon history is that not a lot of people know that there was a Kendal. They might have heard it, they might have heard of Kendal Avenue or Roach Avenue or little hints and bits and pieces of the history, but not a lot of people know that the northeast section of Massillon was in fact here long before Massillon was. So in 1812, Kendal was founded, and Massillon wasn't founded until 1826. And even though all of the publications and history books covered that time period to say that that happened, they didn't look really in-depth at it. So I really wanted to stop at the Civil War, because you could do an entire book on the Civil War here in Massillon, and that was not my goal. So everything up to the Civil War, I wanted to take a look at. So obviously I had to start with reading all of the books that came before. Most of them are really great original sources. If anybody's ever read Perrin's 1881 History of Stark County, it's like the most meandering story ever, but it's like the closest to that early time period that we have. And a lot of the people who were part of the founding of these cities, were actually still alive when that book was published. So a lot of really great information. So I also found that there were a lot of photographs and letters that were donated after most of these other history books had been published, and therefore had never really been looked into or tapped. So I was able to find a lot of really great images and sources. So one of the biggest challenges in the archives, cursive handwriting. That is something that is difficult to read to begin with, but obviously everybody has their own style, and most, I think, of the people who are writing documents here had the strangest, most difficult to read handwriting. For example, when you write out Massillon in cursive in the early days, it looked like one big F to signify that there were two S's. So obviously if you don't know that starting out, and of course I'm asking these poor interns who were never taught cursive handwriting to help me decipher. And that just poses all kinds of challenges. So we all learned together how to read cursive handwriting and how to look these things up. My other favorite thing is that when they refer to ladies, it's typically Mrs. Brown did this. At no point in time did they mention her first name. There are like 20 different Brown families that are here in Massillon, but they presume you know which Mrs. Brown it is. So it was a lot of genealogy and trying to figure out if this is in fact the Mrs. Brown I've been looking for, who'd she marry, where'd she die, all of these things. So lots of interesting people. So I counted yesterday, and all in all of the scans, all of the newspaper articles, scanned images, snapshots, journals, diaries, photo albums, I took 8,000 documents that are all on my computer for me to go through. So obviously, as I said, I left some stuff out. So if anybody wants the grand tour sometime, let me know. So the other problem with publishing the Images of America book is that your captions for each image are limited to 50 to 70 words. Now, I don't know if you all know what that means, but that's very short. So not only could I not say everything that I wanted to say about people or places or the canal, it was very, very shortened. So on your handout, if you'll see there after that fine title page, I have this really cool Google map. And for those of you who don't have a handout, please share with the person next to you. I hope I made enough that everyone can share, play nicely. We're all adults here, right? We good? Are we missing some all the way in the back there? All right, we will get you some. I think Brandon should be bringing them down shortly. So as I started to figure out where some of these places were, it'll say such and such Main Street, such and such Mill Street, Factory Street, all kinds of places that we don't know today because the street names changed in the 1920s. So I realized very early on, I better start plotting these because I'm not going to remember where all of these businesses were. So I started plugging in, little businesses here and there. Here's where the Indian fording was. Here's where the marketplace was. Here's where they sold wheat. And to date, I have approximately 1,500 points on this Google map. So if you are interested, the URL is right there for you to go and investigate on your own, see what was here before. But it's all basically within the time period of this book from 1812 to 1860. All right, so your next slide, you might see two silhouettes there. And for years and years, we've used these images to say that this is Thomas and Charity Roach. And we don't actually know that for sure. And I really tried to investigate and was hoping somewhere, somehow, with the digital age, someone would have portraits of these fine folks available for us. But unfortunately, we did not track down an actual portrait of Thomas and Charity Roach. Awesome. Hey, more handouts. They're coming, everybody. So if you see there, I have put two portraits there. These silhouettes were found in the collection of Spring Hill, And they were supposedly created from the likenesses of other portraits of family members. So you have the Roaches and the Rodmans who married, and so these two portraits here, one is a Roach family member and one is a Rodman family member. So theoretically, Thomas and Charity would look something like these people. Now, I think that this looks like John Travolta and Winona Ryder. So if you could just imagine with me, put John Travolta and Winona Ryder in Quaker clothing, and that is how I envision the founding of Spring Hill and Kendal. So unfortunately, that's all we have are these funky silhouettes that may or may not be sort of kind of like them. One of the coolest things in all of the photographs, because they're now digital, we can zoom in very, very close and find new things in these images, which was really cool, especially when you've got a big street shot. You can zoom in on certain businesses and see what was there, what signage. So this next slide, the top left corner, that is actually Thomas Roach's grocery. It was there. It also functioned as the post office for quite some time. And that is the only known photograph of that business. And thank goodness someone was, this photograph comes specifically from an aerial shot taken from the standpipe near the Sippo Reservoir. And so if you, again, zoom in really, really close, you can see these buildings.
That'd be Wales Road? Wales Road.
I think it's Wales Road and Parkview. If you see page 21 in your book, I think the actual answer will be in there. Because off the top of my head, I'm not remembering. So on the right there, there was a small, tiny little cabin in the corner of a big Spring Hill photograph that showed the entire Spring Hill layout. And here's this little tiny cabin in the side. Now, I haven't been able to confirm that that is or is not Thomas Roach's cabin that he built before Spring Hill, but it was at the approximate location just outside the city limits on Spring Hill. So I imagine Thomas Roach's cabin looked something like that. And then on the bottom, just over the reservoir, the actual dam, is approximately where Thomas Roach had some sort of mill. He had a woolen mill, he had a pottery, he had a grist mill, he had all kinds of production. So this is potentially one of his actual mills. So obviously it's only the roof, but at least it's something that we get to see and we know approximately where it was. So our next slide, I was really hoping against hope that there would be a photograph of Arvine, Wales. We may know Wales Road today, which is in fact named for Arvine, Wales. He and his family inhabited Spring Hill after Thomas and Charity died. And Arvine's big claim to fame was that he was the one who brought all 400 merino sheep from the East Coast here to Kendal for Thomas Roach. So here he is. This is one of only 2 photographs. This one's like, I think, the best because there he is just hanging out, reading a newspaper. He looks super, super studious, and it's a nice, nice view. Of course, you can see if you look up close, he's got striped pants, which are pretty sweet. I didn't know they were way into striped pants, but there we are. So the next thing that I wanted to point out, there are tons of amazing old newspapers. Now, typically when people come forth today with newspapers that they would like to donate, we have to say no because they're so difficult to care for and they're so acidic and full of wood pulp that they basically fall apart even within the first couple of years. If you've ever accidentally left a newspaper sitting out, even on a table or in a window, you can see how quickly that yellows because they're daily newspapers. They're not meant to be saved necessarily. So what's really cool is that all of these early newspapers are in much better shape than even newspapers today because they were made on rag content. So the rag is much more archivally stable than wood pulp is. So as I was reading through this particular 1830 newspaper, I had no idea that mail was only delivered once a week here in Massillon by stagecoach, and they didn't deliver your mail. They would print your name in the newspaper. You had to go pick it up at the post office. So you'll see a list of names there of people who hadn't picked up their mail yet. which is such a strange concept, but I thought that was really cool. So hey, David Beard, please come get your mail. One of the other fabled cool photographs that I was again hoping that I would find in the archives, I think this one's on there, the Alehouse. Yes, perfect. They talked about the Alehouse, and it was a community center, it was a Quaker meeting house, it functioned as a school for a while, and it had started out as a private residence. And I really hope that we could find this photograph. So the reason that it is called the Alehouse is because of the shape of the house. It's just an L, and the back of it's kind of empty, and it literally looks like an L from up top. So that was a super important place within Kendal. Obviously does not exist today, but that was the only photograph that we were able to find, and it did in fact exist in the archives in the oversized residence folder. So there you are. Sometimes you have to be really crafty, because when you take a photo like that, you can put that away in the archives so many different ways. One, it could be the oversized, it could be residences, it could be a community house, it could technically be a religious building, because it functioned as all of those things. So if you just go to the church folder, or if you just go to the residences, you might not always find what you're looking for. It's gonna be sharp, like a fox. All right, our next slide are James and Eliza Duncan. And of course, I tried not to duplicate a lot of this because we had the wonderful Massillon Connection book published in 2014. And that really delves into the James and Eliza Duncan story and how they founded Massillon. So I was really hoping that I could find other portraits of these two folks. Unfortunately, this is, in fact, as far as we can tell, the only portrait of Eliza Duncan that exists. She is the one credited with giving Massillon its name after Jean-Baptiste Massillon, the French cleric. So I actually did contact some of the relatives of the Duncans, like the super descended, with the assistance of my mother. And I actually contacted the Claremont Historical Society in New Hampshire because they supposedly had a portrait of James Duncan. And unfortunately, we have come up empty so far, but I'm not stopping because I want to find them. So yes, the book is published, but I'm still on the lookout. So stay tuned, I'll let you all know if we do in fact find it. And then the next one, we've got quite a lot of buildings that were photographed very early and very late in our history. So the photo on the bottom is actually an Abel Fletcher photograph taken in the 1840s or 1850s. And what's so cool about that is that those buildings were still around when better photographic practices came about. And they actually moved the white building, which is a Masonic temple, across the street. And it would be where the gun range is today, or the former Salvation Army. And unfortunately, James Duncan's mill, which is pictured there, it was basically the first business here in the city of Massillon, is now where the parking lot of our city hall is. So this area right down here in Duncan Plaza, so named because of that, it's really full of history because that's really where Duncan started this whole Massillon endeavor. The next image is the Plat of Massillon in 1826. The reason I wanted to keep this one in here, I wanted to show you the course of the river. I do believe that some of you are old enough to remember when the river moved. It took place between 1939 and 1951. But for those of us who are younger and don't remember that and have to rely on pictures and stories, the river actually did come all the way into downtown, kind of came up to about McDonald's, and that little plaza where Elam's Music is kind of where the course of the river ran. So needless to say, when we talk about things like the 1913 flood, that's why, because the river came so far into downtown, and you've got the canal there, you've got the Sippo Creek, which ran through downtown, so all of these bodies of water, kind of overflowing into downtown. So it makes sense why it was so bad. The really cool part is that the very, very tip of that curve into downtown was marked off on one of the maps as where the Indians would cross, because just over the river was an actual Indian village, which Thomas Roach would actually ride from Kendal down to the Delaware settlement. And he worked with them to make sure that the US government wasn't taking advantage of them, because the Tuscarawas River was literally the dividing line between Indian Territory and America at the time. So they were starting to get pushed out, they kind of expanded, and so Thomas Roach was actually looking out for the American Indian population right there on the other side of the Tuscarawas. So this is actually my favorite view, and unfortunately I did not get it into the book. This is a sketch by Henry Howe. This gentleman actually rode around Ohio, visited every community that he could possibly get into, would do some sort of sketch of their town, and take notes on what was happening, what it was like. He described Massillon as, streets are very clogged with wheat wagons as they came down to the canal to sell their wheat from their farms. And then he gave us this really, really cool sketch. And when I compared it to photographs of downtown, this is exactly what it looked like. My one quandary was where the American House Hotel actually sat. And he answered that by, on the right-hand side there, he's got the American House, the very first one that would have actually burned down just a few years later. There are no photographs of it, there's just this sketch. So I was really excited to know where that was, because I think there were 3 different American houses across the city, and one of them was the Conrad Hotel eventually, and they changed names from American House to Park Hotel to the Conrad to, many different names. So again, trying to trace all of this down through history was very challenging, but not impossible. So the next one here, my other question was, where on earth did James Duncan live? Because I had heard that he had several different houses. Obviously, the Massillon Museum having been part of the library for many, many years, we were in the James Duncan house. But they talked about when he lived at other places. So where were those other places? So his very first residence was the brick house in Kendal. It was the only brick house west of Canton for many years. And they signed the canal contracts in that building, and it has a great significance, and of course does not exist anymore. Then they moved down to Estramajura Farm, right near where the state hospital would later be placed. And he farmed with some sheep, and his family lived there. And then it said that he had a grocery somewhere. And then obviously we know the library building today. So I wasn't sure where this magical third house was, and everybody always said, oh, it's where the Lincoln Theater was. That's about where it was. So then I really wanted to know where specifically it was. So I finally tracked down, and as you can see, it's not the greatest photograph ever. It's like through a delivery wagon, kind of up the hill, cropped off there. But basically he had a very simple house. Half of it was used for a dry goods store, and half of it was used for living quarters. So it actually ended up being about where Shearer's World headquarters are today, just across the street. So not quite on the Lincoln Theater grounds, but just beside it, so pretty close. So everyone always wants to know, where was the canal? And of course it's important to know how the canal and the stream and Sippo Creek, how they all flow together. So that first image, we've got Sippo Lake, which flows down in through Kendal. Today we've got the reservoir stopping most of that. And then it continues down all the way through downtown Massillon and would have come right through here, which is why Duncan had his mill on the Sippo Creek, because that powered his mill. So next slide there, we've got the Sippo Creek is running left to right there. Actually, the flow would be from right to left. And the canal would be going north and south. So today, if we didn't have any buildings there, it would be flowing underneath the Hampton Inn and the Sarda bus station. And it would be flowing underneath what is today Walgreens. So pretty much between First Street West and Erie, right through the middle of there, that's where the canal was flowing. And as you can see there on the right-hand side of that image, Duncan Plaza and the police station, that is where Duncan's mills were located. So a very waterous, Waterous? Yep, Waterous section of town. I invented a word, you're welcome. Equies? All right. The next slide just shows a little bit closer where the old factory was. The Massillon Museum would be in the middle of that at the very top. So we are just, you know, again, like just a couple of steps away from where the old factory was. So as I started researching some of those businesses, I got into those old newspapers, and in the 1854 Massillon News, in January, they had several Russell and Company advertisements. And I noticed that one of the early Abel Fletcher photographs from about 1850 sure looked a heck of a lot like the advertisement for Russell and Company. As you can see there, they've got the same machinery. One just happens to be a sketch of that photograph. So a pretty good representation of what that machinery probably looked like, you know, was used in the newspaper. And then the one thing that I didn't know about the Russell and Company was that they also had metallic burial cases, which are just the strangest looking things. You could rent a hearse to be able to use these, but for the people who are famous for steam engines and you know, building all of these things, I didn't know that that was like a side benefit. But for the most part, people who were good at engineering, they would do all kinds of metal-related creations. You know, people who were furniture makers also made coffins because they were really good at building things with wood. So it kind of made sense, but there's proof, and that's what it theoretically would have looked like. And the Russell brothers themselves, until this book, I hadn't really seen much of the Russell brothers that didn't have epic beards. That's how I would describe the Russell brothers, epic beards. So I was really excited. There was a lady in New Hampshire who's a descendant of the Russell family who did the most epic genealogy of that family. And she donated the two photographs, one of Joseph and one of Nahum. And then Clement, I actually found in a random photo album, but you can tell his beard never changed, it just got white. So he always had an epic beard. So one of the other really exciting things that I came across, but a little bit too late to incorporate into the book, I actually found manumission papers, which are slave freedom papers. There were two sets, two of them from Virginia. This particular image is for Matilda Ann Weaver in 1835 that basically said, upon my death, you know, she is free, and please, you know, give her the appropriate paperwork to set her free. So it's interesting. I'm not sure, I haven't been able to track her down just yet, you know, why those papers ended up here. Did she end up working here, living here? I'm not sure. But, you know, kind of throughout the story, there's so many former slaves or even, you know, free African Americans who settled here and actually made a really good living for themselves. One example is Jerry Clemens. He was a freedman, and he ended up working and being an actual hotel manager in the 1830s, which seems to be, you know, an unheard of sort of thing. So there were many, many opportunities here, and most everyone, not everyone, but most everyone was accepting of them here. So we've got, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm apparently running out of time. So one of the coolest resources ended up being photograph albums. The picture there, it's actually ferns that would have been placed into a photo album in the 1870s and 80s, which is always a festive challenge. How do you keep ferns in a photo album without damaging the album? So within those album pages, I'm going to skip ahead to Frank Reed and his dog. One of our most beloved portraits in the collection, which if anybody was here for the 75th anniversary exhibit that we did in 2008, he was on the cover of the book. It's a very, very large portrait. You know, obviously one of those things that we kind of look at all the time and get used to. And when I was going through these photo albums, lo and behold, there's a slightly older Frank Reed, now that photography's been invented. There's a photograph of him and his dog. And as I was looking at this kind of folksy, not quite accurate to reality portrait, I always thought that the dog's ears were just exaggerated and pointy. But if you look at the picture, his ears are totally pointy. So that answered a long question of mine. So. All right, okay, so the last photograph there that I will talk about, and then I'll open it up for questions, I refer to him as my daguerreotype boyfriend. This is Horatio Watson. He's so pretty. And I just thought that this portrait was so fabulous. It was from the early 1840s, so one of the earlier daguerreotypes in the collection. And it turned out that he and Arvine Wales were best friends, Arvine Wales II, and they would actually correspond, and these letters actually are in the collection of the Massillon Public Library. So I got to read all of Horatio's letters. He talks about the different politicians who come to town. He talks about the sentiment and when things burn down, or talking about the flood. But then he gets a little bit of an itch for adventure. So Horatio actually goes out to the gold rush in 1852 and decides that that's going to be his thing. He's so excited because you have to go to New York, take a ship down through Mexico, go across Mexico into California. It's a very convoluted way to do it. So he talks about bandits on the road, and he says, oh, the next time I'm in town, I'll have to tell you about that time we almost got kidnapped. And then the letters stop. There's no more letters. Why? And of course, at this point, he's already writing really tiny because he's got so much to say. And I'm like, no, I wish we would know. And so the story went in the archives. It's actually written on the transcript. He was never heard from again. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So then my mother and I, while on vacation, were looking up things on Ancestry, and we found out that, he did in fact make it to California. He did start a mining company, and there is one letter in the public library dated 1858. So he did actually establish himself, and of course it's so much more romantic to say that he was never heard from again. But so that is Horatio Watson and my daguerreotype boyfriend. So obviously I can't give you the whole story, but that's why the book is here for you all to enjoy. So are there any questions at this point? Yes?
There is a very, very small, one story, but it must be at most 6 by 6 square building.
So a 6 by 6 small one-story building, where?
It is on the, it's access to the reservoir.
Corner of Wales and Williams.
Wales and Williams.
Could you tell me what that building was ever used for?
Not off the top of my head.
Is that,
Wales and Williams, a one-story
Is that
6
where-
by 6.
is that where the skate sharpener was?
Across the street.
Okay, what was that, Margie?
Wendell wonders whether it was where the skate shop
The
was.
skate shop.
Tony sharpened skates and rented skates, but Tony was across, and he had rented bikes. He was across the street in a building that looked just like that, the turnside.
All right, Maggie, we're gonna have to look that one up. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. That one's not ringing a bell. Gas station? Little tiny? The little brick one. Okay. Barb Whitman had asked about that building, and from the best that we can surmise, it was built in the 1920s as a gas station. It's that little brick with like the super pointy roof, that one. It's so tiny. Yeah, well, I'm assuming all they had to do was like hang out in there until somebody needed gas and they'd come out and pump. So. Thank you, that helped. Next question, yes, Wendell.
The little diamond-shaped park, Charity Roach on 11th Street and Bennington, that diamond shape, they have a plaque. Is that where the charity school actually was?
No.
What was there? Why?
It's just on the land that the farm occupies.
Okay.
But the school was on up the hill, kind of on the curve of Coventry.
Yeah, so Charity School was up Wales Road, and where it starts to curve, if you look to your left, I mean, it's, now a housing development, but that's where the school was at the top of that hill.
Did they own where Charity Ross, did they own that property?
Yes, yeah, the school actually owned all of the farmland because that was part of the Charity School curriculum, was for boys to go and farm and for girls to learn housewifery. Yeah, it's really great. Now imagine, we are still caring for her money from that school. We are now a foundation as opposed to an actual school. How do we, as 21st century folk, interpret farming and housewifery as education? So what do you give scholarships to? That's a toughie. So we've gone with things like nursing, and there's a great program down at Archivist with some farming, and there's a place at OSU, the extension in Worcester, that does, you can major in animal husbandry and all kinds of really great programs that match kind of what 1826 would interpret. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to clean an attic out up here. Betty Peters owned the house, it's tore down now.
Okay.
It's right across from Wendy's. And I found a bunch of photographs that were metal. It was supposed to be a photographer on Erie Street, the lady told me at the museum. I found them, and I found a 1919 Massillon yearbook that I donated to the museum. I just wanted to share that with you. I didn't know if there was a photographer on Erie or not.
There are many photographers who function on
Quite
Erie.
famous, the way I understand.
Well, there's Abel Fletcher, who was the very first, who came here in 1843, but by the time tintypes would have come around, it would have been his wife, because he lost his eyesight in a darkroom explosion as he was mixing his own chemicals.
To the museum.
Okay.
Up here. And they,
To the library?
Yeah, I donated.
Okay. I'll have to ask about those. Yes, when they're metal photographs, those are tintypes, and those are from about the Civil War era. So those are always the good ones to save. So don't ever throw them away. All right, one more question.
Where was the Alehouse located?
Dang it. Where was the Alehouse located? Great question. Let me ponder on that for one moment. Thank you. State and 11th Street. As you'll recall, of course, there were 75 panes of glass in it. Yeah, so State and 11th in Kendal, which I can't remember what's there now. Just a house? Okay, so it's just a house today. It's interesting to see that there's a lot of like 1940s and 1920s homes that replaced a lot of those original Kendal houses. But because of Thomas Roach's rules about what size the houses had to be, you can go through, go up Wales Road, and when you see a house that's like a story and kind of a half with tiny windows, that's typically from the era, and there's a lot of them left. Obviously, most of them are a little bit covered up with siding, and that makes it, hard to tell, but there's many, many of them left. So. All right, well, I will be signing books back here. Please go ahead and purchase, and thank you all so much for coming tonight.